Thank you all for being here. We have the small but the best audience. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to resume where I left off. This is in the mid-1800s. Charles Darwin, after sitting on data for 30 years, published his book on evolution in 1859. At the time, it was not really a theory. I guess you'd call it a hypothesis, but he explained how species came into existence without the benefit of miracles or biblical creation. And the significance of this was picked up immediately by theologians in England, where he first published. And then within a year or so, copies of his book made it into the universities in this country, and in particular Harvard, where Unitarian theologists had a chance to look at it. Up until this time, German scholarship had raised serious questions about the trustworthiness of the New Testament, in particular the Gospels. But for the first time, we had science directly attacking the trustworthiness of the Old Testament. And for Christians, this raised really serious questions, because if you couldn't trust the biblical creation stories, if they were mythological, then where did the doctrine of original sin come from? And without original sin, exactly what is Christ saving people from? And of course, it raised the overall question of, is the Bible actually inspired by God? And if it is, what does that mean? Okay, I'm going to jump ahead 1 year. The Unitarian Society of Toledo, I'm going to be jumping back and forth, but I'm going to try to keep this more or less chronological. But I'll be jumping from Toledo to National and then back and forth. The Unitarian Society of Toledo was established just before the Civil War. Toledo was a thriving little community of around 10,000 people at the time. They had visiting ministers coming here, but no permanent minister. Civil War got started the next year, and neither Unitarians nor Universalists were pacifist. They fought. As it turns out, Reverend Tim told me that he discovered that there was at least one Confederate Unitarian officer. So that answered the question as to whether or not the Unitarians joined the Confederacy. Some did. But by far the biggest number of Unitarians were from New England. They were mostly abolitionists, and they were more than happy to fight to end slavery. The 1st Black Regiment, the Massachusetts 54th, was led by a Unitarian, Robert Shaw. Now, the Universalists were not totally out of things. The first female ordained minister probably in the world was a Universalist. She was ordained in 1863. The Universalist General Convention was a new organization of Universalist churches. They did have a meeting that was a convention, but they called their whole organization the Universalist General Convention. And you'll notice their logo has a cross, which was in the center of things, sitting on top of what's supposed to be the Holy Bible. So the Universalists were still firmly Christian, in contradistinction to Unitarians who were starting to waffle about their Christianity. Into this mixture comes Frank Abbott. He graduated from Meadville, if I remember right, in 1864, and became minister of the Unitarian Church in Dover, New Hampshire. And as it turned out, he had been reading Darwin, and he was convinced that miracles didn't happen and that Christianity was a childish religion and not fit for adults. At the same time, the Unitarian churches decided to have their own national convention. Now this was a formal meeting, and I think that these meetings may have been the forerunners of what became the General Assemblies. But anyway, they met just as the Civil War was concluding, and the preamble to their organization included the terms "disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the service of God and the building up of the kingdom of his Son." And it's capitalized as it was in the original. Abbott couldn't tolerate this. He had become very liberal by this time and decided that either his church was going to have to change or else people were going to have to leave his church. So anyway, as it turned out, people in his church, some of them agreed with him, some didn't, and the ones that didn't agree with him filed a court action to force him out. And eventually this was decided by the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and they forced him to leave. So anyway, Abbott and others, including Ralph Emerson, formed their own organization, which they called the Free Religious Association. And using the terminology of the time, they called it a spiritual anti-slavery society. Now, Toledo, by the mid-1860s, was without a minister. They became aware that Abbott was looking for a job, and he had candidated in Detroit and came to Toledo and candidated there, and eventually he accepted the call from the Unitarian Society of Toledo to become the minister here. By this time, Toledo had about 12 to 13,000 people in it. It was a thriving community. This is a railroad, actually. This is a railroad out here. The city had not quite made it as far west as Detroit Avenue. This is the canal going through town. And there are railroads going in and out all over the place. Anyway, Abbott said he would come to Toledo and become the minister of the Unitarian Society, but only if they disaffiliated from the Unitarian Church and changed their name. So anyway, he came here in 1869 and changed the name of the Unitarian Society to the Independent Society of Toledo. While he was here, he started publishing the Index, which was a periodical that was being published out of the Blade Printing Office, Toledo Blade Printing Office. The Index was a paper of, as he stated here, free religion. A lot of it was taken up with his own sermons, which he thought highly of. He did not have a small ego. As it turned out, he was an admirer of Darwin and sent Darwin copies of his Index. And it turned out Darwin liked what he read, and so they had sort of a mutual admiration society going on. Now, Abbott's theology was what he called scientific theism. He was not an atheist, he was not an agnostic, but he felt science was the key to learning about God. He also believed that any religion that was valid, for adults at least, had to conform to science to be acceptable. So he decided mainstream Christianity was not appropriate for adults. He did not believe in miracles. Unfortunately, Abbott tended to be a lecturer. He was not a warm and fuzzy person. He was described as having a prickly personality, and he was terrible with pastoral care skills. And people in 1870 needed pastoral care as much as people in 2023. And so membership started to fall away from the Independent Society. A group of members formed what they called the Unity Church Association. Abbott was forced to resign from the Independent Society, partly because they had so few members they couldn't afford to pay him anymore. Both groups disintegrated within a year. By the way, I want to give credit to Reverend Tim for providing me with key information on what was going on here in Toledo, because he got into our church archives and found all kinds of stuff that I didn't have access to. Okay, the next thing that happened, this is on the national level, the ethical culture movement got started in 1876 by Felix Adler. Adler was not Unitarian. In fact, he was Jewish. In fact, he was a rabbi. His father had been a rabbi. Adler went through yeshiva or whatever he had to go through to become a rabbi then. And he conducted one religious service at his father's synagogue. It turned out it was his last service. He was real liberal, and apparently way too liberal for the Jewish community at that time. So anyway, he formed the ethical culture movement, which became the precursor of humanism. And this is the idea of the inherent worth and dignity. He called human worth and uniqueness. So you can see where we got that particular line. He believed that we could be moral by doing the best things that we could. He believed in the interrelatedness of people. And he said that morality did not have anything to do with theology. So this is a real break from religion. Many religions then, and even now, teach it unless you believe in God and believe in their religion, you can't be moral. Adler said no. Okay, what was going on in the United States at the time? Well, there were demographic changes. People were leaving the farms and moving into the cities. Now, at this time, the Universalist churches were mostly rural. They had money, but they didn't have much membership. The mainstream Protestant churches at the time were softening their theologies because a lot of people didn't like this harsh Calvinistic teaching where you didn't know if you were going to make it to heaven even if you tried to be good, and the idea of people being terrible inherently, which is what Calvinism taught. So the mainstream churches started playing this down. People came from the countryside who had been Universalists and joined mainstream Christian churches. Meanwhile, the Unitarians, being more intellectual, were attracting educated people and even some agnostics and true atheists. This is in the late 1870s. Meanwhile, back here, there was no Unitarian presence formally in Toledo, either from 1875 or else from 1883. We're not sure of the date. But until 1887, there was no formal Unitarian church here. The American Unitarian Association sent a Civil War veteran who was a Unitarian minister named Allen Jennings to get things restarted here. First service in 1887 had 25 people. They started calling themselves the Church of Our Father in 1888. This is the forerunner of our church. The earlier Unitarian Society broke up and they technically were not part of our congregation. Church of Our Father was. Membership grew. They put up a new building on Ashland and Prescott. It was a nice building. It had enough room for all kinds of social activities and things. They put this up in 1893. Now at that time, the church had one service on Sunday at 10:30, and Sunday school began after the worship service at 12 noon, which tells me that they expected the children to be in the service with the adults. There was a young people's social group, which was called Channing Union, met a couple times a month. There was a ladies' union, which became the forerunner of the Alliance. This was started by Reverend Jennings' wife. Now, back to the national scene in 1894, the Church of All Souls in Evanston, Illinois, came out with this creedal statement, which may have a familiar look to it. This is attributed to their minister, the Reverend James Blake. Very, very similar to what we're using now at the present time. Meanwhile, the Universalist General Convention had a meeting in 1899, and they proclaimed the most important things for their religious belief. These are the Universalists now: God, Jesus Christ, the immortal soul, the reality of sin, and universal reconciliation. They were Universalists. They believed everybody eventually made the trip that way. Now, the Church of Our Father, this is us, here in Toledo in 1895, came up with its own creedal statement where they believed in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the leadership of Jesus. No mention of Christ here, the leadership of Jesus. Salvation by character, the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. That last line seems to have been borrowed from the ethical culture movement. Now, that doesn't sound real Christian, and that's probably how many of the followers felt. However, they had this other statement, which they called their bond of union. In the love of truth and in the spirit of Jesus Christ, whatever that means, we unite for the worship of God and the service of man. So they were still waffling themselves a little bit about their Christian beliefs. Now, exactly what spirit of Jesus Christ means, I don't know. Maybe they didn't know either. Now, in 1908, the Church of Our Father formally and legally changed its name to what we have now. Same group, different name. They saved up their pennies, and in 1923 built the church at Collingwood and Bancroft that we know now. Humanism came into existence as a formal organization. This wasn't started by Unitarians, but many Unitarians adopted it. The American Humanist Association issued their first manifesto in 1933, and this is how they described themselves: a progressive philosophy of life that, without theism or other supernatural beliefs, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. No mention of a deity in there. And eventually they became more open about their lack of a belief in God, or the lack of necessity of believing in God to be ethical. Now, the Unitarians and the Universalists had a couple things in common. They were both hurting. The Unitarians were hurting in money. The Universalists were hurting in membership. They were both considered outcasts by mainstream Christianity, and even though their theologies were not really too aligned, they recognized they had a need to work together. And so they decided to combine forces and publish the hymnal that we are still using. So this was combined, this is a combination of the Unitarians and the Universalists, 1937. Okay, now locally here again, we have a situation that gave our church national impact. This involves the Reverend Walton Cole, who was minister here during the 30s and up into the entrance of the United States into World War II. The story begins in Royal Oak, Michigan. This is the red dot, red square is Oakland County, immediately north of Detroit. Father Charles Coughlin was appointed the Monsignor of the Shrine of the Little Flower Church in Royal Oak in 1926. He started a radio broadcast on WJR, which unfortunately was called the Goodwill Station. His radio program was aired weekly and it was uplinked to CBS. And eventually he was being listened to by about a fourth of the population of the United States. He published a paper, Social Justice Newsletter, which was sent out to anybody who wanted it. And by the mid-30s, he was considered to be the preeminent spokesperson for the Catholic Church on faith and politics. Now, by 1938, he had given up any progressive ideas he had, and he became fascist. He was anti-Roosevelt, anti-New Deal, and especially anti-Semitic. He even blamed the Russian Revolution on the Jews collectively. And he promoted an anti-Semitic book that had been floating around since the turn of the century called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. He talked about it on his radio broadcast and published excerpts of it in Social Justice beginning in 1939. These are two versions of the protocols in English. It turns out it was published in all the European languages, the first one being German, and a person named Hitler read it and believed every word. In fact, this is possibly the main reason he became as virulently anti-Semitic as he was, because he believed that the protocols explained how the Jews were trying to take over the world. He believed it, every word of it. Anyway, Detroit had a big Jewish community, and they were horrified by Father Coughlin. They were well aware of what was going on in Europe at the time. So they weren't sure how to respond to this, and they didn't know if they should respond personally or if they should find somebody else who wasn't Jewish to defend them. They ultimately decided to find somebody Jewish to defend, or who wasn't Jewish to defend them. They called on Reverend Cole here at First Unitarian Church. Now, he was already preaching religious tolerance, and he appealed to the Catholic Church about Coughlin, which didn't do any good at all. The Jewish Community Council in Detroit worked with Cole for a year, and he dutifully drove up Dixie Highway multiple times to do public addresses and to present his own radio broadcast paid for by the Jewish Council. Coughlin continued to broadcast until a new bishop was appointed in 1942, who shut him down. Coughlin remained Monsignor, but he didn't have a radio program anymore. Okay, meanwhile, the Universalist Church of America changed its logo. Now this is significant because there's still a cross in the middle of the circle, but the cross isn't in the middle anymore. So they did de-emphasize Christianity to that extent. Now the Unitarians and Universalists realized they had enough in common that they wanted to merge, even though the theologies weren't the same. They felt the need to get together formally. They formed the Combined Religious Youth Organization, the LRY, 1954. And the formal merger occurred in 1961. 1793 is the first Universalist church in the United States, and 1825 is when the American Unitarian Association was formed. Their official logo originally was this, and then they changed logos a few times. Or we did, this is us. So the Unitarians, many of them became humanists. Now humanism didn't start with Unitarians, but Unitarians adopted it. And so the UU Humanist Association began in 1962. Now, by 1965, our church here in Toledo had over 1,000 members. Think about that. The pews were filled. Unitarians were very active in the civil rights movement. And a Unitarian minister, James Reeb, was murdered in Selma the same year. And his death apparently was a major impetus in getting the Voting Rights Act passed through Congress. Now, one of the things that almost tore the Unitarian Universalist Association apart was this empowerment controversy that went on for about 4 years. In 1967, a group of black Unitarian Universalists from California demanded that a caucus be created, or they were a caucus, and they made some non-negotiable demands that a Black Affairs Council be established and funded by the UUA. Anyway, there were a couple of exciting General Assemblies that followed this. There was a General Assembly in Cleveland in 1968. They voted to fund the Black Affairs Council. Unfortunately, there was not enough money in the till to handle it. So there was a really raucous General Assembly the following year in Boston, where many of the UUA delegates walked out, and some came back, some didn't. But anyway, this got enough bad publicity that membership overall started declining. This is 1969. And many Unitarians just didn't want to be associated with this kind of controversy. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War was stepping up, and Unitarians, for the most part, were opposed to it. The LGBTQ ministry started in 1973. Now, the movement, again, did not start with Unitarians, but Unitarians picked up on it very quickly. The Pride movement began in 1978. The 7 principles that we have now, which are being revised, were adopted formally in 1984, so we've had them that long. Oops, and we're all familiar with this. We've got it in our pews. There was a group of pagans that showed up at the 1987 General Assembly, and they petitioned to be accepted as members of the UUA. They were accepted. As it turns out, various congregations sometimes didn't welcome them that much. And the reason being that a lot of Unitarians had enough trouble believing in one God. And the pagans, at least theoretically, could believe in multiple deities. However, they were very environmental, had great environmental concerns, and so then they were more or less welcomed. The Green Sanctuary movement started a few years later. Now, the sources were published in 1995, or they were modified. The first group was in 1984, but in 1995, the last source was added to satisfy the pagans. This is the spiritual teachings of the earth-centered traditions. So that was added to satisfy the pagans in the church. Human Rights Campaign, again, started outside the Unitarian Universalist Association, but adopted. The Standing on the Side of Love movement, this is a direct response to the shooting at a Tennessee Valley UU church in 2008. They changed this from standing on the side of love to being on the side of love, because they wanted to make it more inclusive for people that use wheelchairs. The BLM started in 2013 in response to Trayvon Martin's murder. This again didn't start within the church, but was quickly adopted by UU churches around the country. Now, I did find some statistical information. Some of us is a little bit old, and so I'm not sure, we could take it with a few grains of salt, but as of 2001, we're talking almost 25 years ago here, 22 years ago, half of UUs said they were humanists. Didn't say that they were secular humanists, but they were humanists. I guess secular humanists don't come to church. They stay home on Sunday morning. The religious humanists come down here. Well, I mean, I don't know how you define it otherwise. A third of UUs said they were agnostic. Almost a third said they were earth-centered. 18% were full-blown atheists. Over 16% said they were Buddhist. Well, you can be Buddhist as a philosophy and still be all of these other things at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. The pagans and the earth-centered, I think, would probably be about the same group. And 13% of UU still said that they were Christian. So anyway, given all this mix, I was wondering if UUs actually have a written source of enlightenment that anyone would, that we could all agree on. And I decided it's probably this. My little joke for the morning. But true. Okay, now there was some survey data that now is really old. It's 14, 15 years old, surveying religions around the country, but especially with an emphasis on UUs. And I eliminated a lot of the stuff because I thought it was so old that it wasn't too applicable, but I left a few things. The trend between 1990 and 2008 showed that the percentage nationally, not just in the churches, but the share of non-Hispanic whites in the United States decreased, and the percentage of non-Hispanic whites in UU congregations decreased from 90% white to 75% white. And this was largely due to increased numbers of Hispanic people. Our churches at the time, at least 2008, still had an underrepresentation of African American, Asian, and other racial groups. The trend, I think, is continuing. And this is how it was shown in bar graph form. The yellow part here is the white membership. Now this is UUA 2008 compared to 1990. This is the whole United States population. So the US population by 2008 had dropped to 66% Caucasian. The UUA was still whiter than that, and we were still 75% Caucasian. Now in politics, this isn't going to be any huge surprise. Unitarians are politically active. As of 2008, 90% were registered compared to the national average of only 76%. In 2008, there were twice as many Democrats as Republicans at the national level. The ratio, well, actually, that's not there. There are twice as many UUs identified as Democrats, but the ratio between Republicans and Democrats changed from 1990, where it was 2-to-1, Democrats to Republicans. By 2008, it was 11-to-1. That's the year Barack Obama was elected. You can imagine what it is now. And there was a similar proportion of self-proclaimed independent people. So politically, now here you'd think of red being Republican, but they didn't do it that way. Yellow here is Republican, and blue is Democratic, and these are the independents over here and others. These are the USA numbers, 2008, the UUA numbers, 2008. And you can see there were lots more Democrats here than there were nationally. Okay.
They count you as being a Democrat, not by, if you have a card, so that they count by who you vote for?
Yeah, how you're registered.
How you identify?
That's how you're registered. That's usually how you define it. And that information is public. Okay, so one of the results of these various surveys was that congregations that were most likely to grow were ones that were that considered themselves to be spiritually alive and vital. Congregations that had strong permanent leadership. So this would mean that fellowships, not so much. And congregations that enjoy what they were calling joyful, innovative, and inspirational worship. These were the ones most likely to grow. Now this is in the face of the fact that Unitarian membership, the UU membership, has been dropping steadily overall. Okay, they talked about guitar and drum use. They're talking about electric guitars here, not folk guitars. Electric guitars and drums came to be popular in many of the evangelical churches. And this was considered by many to be an indication of contemporary worship, not so much with us. The few U churches that were using drums as of 2008, 2010, usually didn't do it if they had an older membership like us. And a lot of older members don't have much use for electric guitars and drums. So this showed the breakdown here. You could compare the year 2000 with 2010. Now it's still old information, but compared to the evangelical churches where half of them were using electric guitars and drums, only 7% of our churches were using electric guitars and drums. Okay, by age, well, congregations with older populations are less likely to grow. And unfortunately, UU congregations are growing more with older members. So if you're not attracting young people, we're not going to grow much. The end. Thank you very much. I got done in a good time. I'll try to answer questions if I can, and if I can't, Reverend Tim is back there and he can answer them.
Yes. During the time that the Universalists joined with the Unitarians, were there any specific people that were instrumental in bringing the two groups together?
Yeah, I'm sure there were. There was the leadership of both organizations, the Universalist Church of America and the AUA.
That people make a fuss over and say.
Not that I could find. Well, one thing of significance is when the merger occurred, almost all Unitarian churches accepted the merger. That wasn't true with the Universalists. There were some Universalist churches that did not want to be part of a joint organization with the Unitarians.
Is that why there's just a Universalist out in Lyons?
The Universalist Church in Lyons is actually a UUA church.
Okay.
Are there still Universalists?
Well, it's not supposed to be. I mean, they still call themselves the Universalist Church of Lyons, but that they did join, they did merge. They were part of the merger, but there were Universalist churches that said no.
And they're still.
You know, they said they thought that the Unitarians were too liberal and not Christian enough. And the Universalists were Christian right up until the merger. Most Unitarians at that time, by 1961, not so much. I mean, a lot of Jews were joining the Unitarian churches, and they didn't want to have anything to do with Christianity. And a lot of atheists and agnostics didn't want to have anything to do with Christianity. That didn't happen on the Universalist side. Now, on the other hand, my own interpretation, even now, is that people who were Universalists were more huggy. We were the intellectual, I thought we were more intellectual and they were huggier than us. But anyway, you know, Lyons Church is sort of typical of Universalist churches, namely it was small and rural, and they lost membership. You know, they've been hanging on by the skin of their teeth for many years. No, they supported, the ones who left supported the Black Power movement. The problem was that the UUA couldn't afford the non-negotiable demands. In fact, there were some white UUs who really objected to anybody coming in and making non-negotiable demands. I mean, that really raised the hair on the back of their necks. But the people who walked out, I think, if I remember right, they were people who supported the empowerment movement, and they were not satisfied that the UUA was doing enough. And the leadership of the UUA said, we don't have any money. I mean, we've lost a whole bunch of members all of a sudden in the last year. How are we going to fund this? I don't know of any churches that changed their name formally. Whatever they had been, they kept. You know, they might have added the phrase after that, Unitarian Universalist, but for the most part, they kept whatever names they had. There was a conversation.
There was opposition to changing the name.
Well,
Because we were historically.
Unitarian. You know, in reality, the influence of the Universalists has been minimal. And I'm doing a little editorializing here, but most of what's going on here is the Unitarian Church as it has evolved in the 20th century, where Christianity and the belief in Christ were totally de-emphasized. The Universalist part of it, yeah, I mean, hopefully we picked up some of the warmth that the Universalist churches had, but not the theology. But in reality, if you look at the way we actually do things here, there's not much of the traditional Universalist Christian, everybody goes to heaven belief that the Universalists had. With all this Bible scholarship that was going on in the 1800s and the controversy over the theory of evolution, the Unitarians were right on the front of that. The Universalists, not so much. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't really have any discussion. You know, the Bible was fine for them, and they still believed in Christ. They believed in original sin. They believed in all of these things that were in the Bible, and they didn't want to know about science. They didn't want to know about Bible scholarship. So there was a significant difference in the outlook on the world between the Universalists and the Unitarians. There was so much ill feeling going on at the time that I think the UUA was paralyzed. Thank you very much.